Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hi, I'm Gerard Stewart. I'm coordinating the webinar program on behalf of the NFM research program. Today, we're very pleased to have with us Professor Chris Spray, Dr. Andrew Black, and Dr. Barry Hankin, and they're going to talk about the Eddleston Water Project. Just before I hand over to them, I've got a couple of housekeeping points. MS Teams seems to keep changing the way it works, and perhaps I'm a very slow learner. Just a second. Anyway, yeah, if you could please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off, so that they aren't distracting for other people. Yeah, sorry about this. Anyway, yeah, please do ask questions during the webinar. You can use the chat function to do that, and yeah, we've had some very lively conversations in the chat in previous webinars, so please do use that. We are recording the webinar, and that will be available shortly after the event. Yeah, I need to let you know that for GDPR purposes, but also you can access the previous 21 webinars on NFM on our website. So I'll post a link to that in the chat during the webinar. So the program, the NFM research program, it's a 4-year, £4 million program, and we're carrying out novel science to improve the understanding of NFM where possible, including quantification. We're looking at a range of NFM measures in different types of catchments, flooding scenarios, and at different scales. And the aim is to improve evidence and understanding for policymakers and practitioners. There are 3 projects making up the program, and they're in different they're being carried out in geographically different parts of the country and on slightly different aspects of NFM. So there's QNFM, Landwise, and Protect NFM, and you can find out more about those on our website. So working with partners is a really important part of the research, and engaging with them is essential to the success of our work. So the Eddleston Water Project isn't part of the NFM research program, but we're really working to try and build and contribute to the NFM community and understanding within that community. So this webinar that is in that spirit. So I think that's probably enough from me. I'll hand over now, and I hope your slides work better than mine. I think it's Andrew I'm handing over to.
All right, afternoon, Gerard. Thank you very much. So I'll just share the screen, and then Chris is going to lead off with the presentation.
Great, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody from sunny Scotland. This is a 3-part talk, as you can see. I'm going to do the context. Andrew's going to then talk about the empirical work we've been doing on flooding. Barry's going to be talking about some modelling, and I'll come back at the end and just say a little bit about the ecological restoration and on cost benefit. So next slide, please. Starting off then with the context, it's worth stating that obviously in Scotland, natural flood management, NFM as we say, is very much part of an overall vision of flood risk management within a wider context of sustainable flood risk management. So this isn't NFM versus traditional or anything else like that. It's part of it. And very much got a policy focus on restoring natural features where possible in the landscape, altering and enhancing them to actually improve the processes that they're actually delivering, but also introducing engineering, flood protection, with designed walls and all on. So very much catchment based, sources and pathways, clearly hugely partnership working, and one of the things you'll see through this is numerous partnership logos, not just the key ones on this one, Tweed Forum, Scottish Government, SEPA, and the Interreg North Sea region Building with Nature, who are the key ones behind this. Okay, next one, please. So if we then look at what the Eddleston project starts to do, well, it relates to the Flood Risk Management Act, this really impressive piece of legislation back in 2009, and Section 20 in particular, which requires the natural characteristics of a catchment to be assessed to their capacity, costs and benefits to reduce flood risk. So right up front, way back in 2009, we'd actually put that out in the legislative context. But at the same time, the parliamentary inquiry and various of us working in Scotland recognised that we needed better scientific information on a whole load of areas, both on the social sciences and on the hydrological sciences as well. Oh, Andrew, can you put that into main screen full show? It's on, I think someone's just said, aha, brilliant, thank you. Sorry about that, folks. The process then that was taken forward was that Scottish Government looked at a whole series of projects, a whole series of investigations, as I said, including both social sciences as well as the hydrophysical biological sciences. And the Eddleston is one of these pieces of work being taken forward. And the project aims of the Eddlestons are threefold. One, to assess the effectiveness of NFM measures to reduce flood risk. Secondly, to assess the impact of restoration on habitats and species. And that A and B really encapsulates the whole idea of a catchment approach about restoring processes across a whole catchment, not just thinking that NFM is about flooding or that river restoration can't also help with flood risk management. But the third one, absolutely key to us, is that we're going to work with the landowners in the community to maximise their benefits. What you have to understand is that all the work that goes on in the Eddleston has been taken forward voluntarily by the farmers. So it's very much a case of having to work with them to work out what works for them as a farm business, as well as what works as a research process as well. Very much learning by doing. Began with a long-term study back in 2009 with a scoping study done by Dundee University and CBEC Engineering. And funded throughout mainly by Scottish Government, but also with EU as well. But also with Tweed Forum, key in finding a lot of other support from the private sector, from the community and elsewhere as we went forward. It's a very typical catchment. It's 69 square kilometres. In the top diagram, you can just see Edinburgh hidden behind the green bit there. So we're on the borders. It's not the only natural flood management even going on in the borders. Those are some other ones that Tweed Forum have been involved in. And from the start, it had a very detailed hydrological and ecological monitoring network. Okay, Andrew? So, as I said, it began with a scoping study, and that was important because that gave us the outputs, which were the possibilities of where we might do natural flood management and what interventions, but also the priorities. We also had to produce a monitoring strategy, a stakeholder engagement and communication strategy. And the monitoring strategy in particular covered the whole range. So again, it wasn't just about the detail of the hydrology that Andrew will talk about, but it was also about river habitats and hydromorphology and a lot of else in between, a lot of work on landowner, community engagement, ecosystem services, historical and everything else as well. Okay, thanks. So the scoping study that was led by Alan Werity, as I said, and Dundee University and CBEC, produced this range of potential options. No discussion with landowners at this point. This was an academic's view of what you might do, a whole range of different types of things, from creating temporary flood storage to planting trees, increasing roughness, remeandering channels. You can see absolutely everything there. So that was the absolute ideal, where we are a research project with unknown, unlimited budget and an unlimited ability to do all sorts of things. We then had to go to the reality, and the next step takes us into how we do that. So next slide, please, Andrew. What we did there was to work through Tweed Forum. For those of you who don't know Tweed Forum, they've been around for over 30 years, a participative catchment NGO who look to improve the habitats and the economic and social life of the borders and around the Tweed. They then act as the trusted intermediary. They understand farming, they can go to farmers, they can talk about the opportunities. So we really gave them a list of the potential opportunities, and they went out onto the farms to meet them. Numerous cups of tea, unlimited numbers of glasses of whiskey, discussions were had to try and find out things that worked for land managers. One of the other interesting things with this is nearly all done by a shake of a hand or a nod of the head. This isn't massive legal agreements. This really is trust, absolutely two-way between the farmers and Tweed Forum and us as the researchers. Okay, so that's the starting point. And as I said, what have we done? Well, that's the quick up to date. I've put 3.5 kilometers of meandering. That's a little bit untrue. It's probably about 2.9, but there is a digger at this very moment meandering down the bottom end, and there will be more trees going in. So you can see that huge range of up to 37 temporary ponds, huge numbers of debris dams of different sorts, something like 207 hectares of native trees, and a group of meanderings. What there isn't, though, is a overall plan of the order in which these occurred, because, as I said, this is about negotiating with farmers and agreeing with them what might be possible on their land. And of course, the timescales in which they work and which we work don't necessarily follow what an academic process would love in terms of what you do research. So with that, I'm going to hand on to Andrew, who's going to take you through the real detail of the hydrology and that side of it. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Chris. So really much of the focus of what I'm going to talk about is going to be dealing with the empirical aspects of the Eddleston study. It was part of the design from the outset that the answers that we should be providing should be based strongly on empirical evidence rather than relying too much on modelling studies alone. So we needed to instrument the catchment with measurement techniques for inputs and outputs of water with such spatial detail as the budget would allow. So that involved installing a weather station, shown in the top left photograph, water level recorder sites such as that bottom left, and also calibrations to measure the flow. Some of you will recognize the equipment involved here. Periodically to calibrate water level records through to flow. And latterly, we've had increasing focus on process studies as well. The network started off with 11 stream flow gauging sites, and then now today we're up at about 25. So there's been massive growth as we've improved the detail, particularly beginning to concentrate more on small catchments. But from the outset, there was a lot of nesting of the monitoring taking place. So the smallest catchment was 2 square kilometers, and the catchment outfall was 69 square kilometers. We started off with 4 rain gauge sites, and now we have 8. And in addition, there's some pond level monitoring as well. For those of you interested in rain gauges, we started off with straight-sided gauges, such as the one in the middle on the right-hand photo there. And the first 3 sites had check gauges as well on a storage principle. But latterly, we've moved to aerodynamic rain gauges, given concerns expressed about the effects of gauge design on catch efficiency. The graph at the bottom left-hand corner is a hypsometric curve, and some of you will know that that shows the distribution of heights of grid squares across the catchment above sea level. And so the first gauges were represented by the red dots on this curve, showing that one of them was close to the lowest ground in the catchment. One was quite close to the highest ground, about the 90th percentile elevation, and 2 were in between at around 50%. And then latterly, we've added additional gauges, which are shown on the curve there, but we're really helping to plug gaps in the map of rain gauges across the catchment. I just wanted to emphasize, because there is an empirical focus through this work, that rain gauges measure rain, and they're not necessarily so good at measuring snow. And we see here two gauges, rain gauges, where actually the gauges are empty of snow. The snow has melted through the gauges, and yet snow remains on the ground. And so they're not the best characterization of snow distribution and snow melt across the catchment as a whole. We have latterly, just in the last winter, added an acoustic sensor, which allows the rise of the ground level and then its fall as snow falls and then melts to be represented and captured in data. But it will be expensive and time consuming to do that everywhere. And one spot isn't always a great way of characterizing the whole catchment. In terms of the streamflow gauging, I know, some previous presentations in this series have looked at the use of flumes and other artificial structures. We felt that that might be against the spirit of a natural flood management study, and field-based hydrometrists over the years have taught me that sometimes attempts to intervene and alter the form of natural channels only results in movement of sediment, erosion, destruction of your equipment. And so we were trying to work sympathetically with the existing channels in the choices of sites and the methods of installation that we have. So the top left photo shows a steel pipe used as a mini stilling well to protect our instruments, an unvented hobo water level recorder in there, and the staff gauge used for check purposes. And the top right shows another view of the same channel. It's very short, small. Lower photo shows another site on a larger part of the Eddleston Water in Eddleston Village, and you can see a couple of stage boards peeping out from behind the undergrowth there. And the lower photo I chose specifically because it shows the type of channel control that there might be. Forming a pool, this is important for generating accurate flow data. So it's just a natural feature within the gravels, and it may be subject to change during flooding episodes. Another example here, a narrow channel where the banks of the river hold back the stream, and you can see the pool formed by that constriction. That's thought to be an advantageous location for monitoring on the Longcoat water. And here we have a rare example of a masonry weir which has been built across the river by riparian owners in the past. So that forms a nice stable section where we can monitor water levels and hope to get a nice reliable relationship between water level and flow as we do our calibration check gaugings. I wanted to put these photos in just to illustrate how the floodplain may alter over time, particularly when you have a natural flood management project. So here, this is the Middle Burn again, and in 2013, the riparian corridor was fenced and trees were planted. And so in the lower photograph, 2013, we see the results of grazing with very short vegetation on the floodplain. In the 2020 photo, you see the river's out of bank a bit, but the riparian vegetation has grown substantially meantime. So we have hydraulically a much rougher surface over which the water flows, and that's challenging in terms of hoping to have a continuous stable relationship between water level and flow. Same sort of idea in one of the re-meandered sections. The oval shows the location of the Cringleton gauging station, and in the distance there, weed. Right-hand photograph, much more riparian vegetation as the years have rolled by, and again, this site is fenced off from grazing animals. We have some monitoring in the ponds, particularly the larger ones seen under construction here, and also some of the two of the ponds adjacent to the lower main stem. And I must refer to the work of our colleagues at the BGS. So they have a network of boreholes for monitoring groundwater levels on the floodplain, on the adjacent hill slope. We have the water levels in the river level, in the main channel itself, and work published by Briege O'Doherty at BGS and Alan MacDonald and colleagues has shown some of the interactions between how water flows into floodplain areas from the hill slope and from the channel in reverse direction, how those things interact. Tom Ball at Winchester has been involved in monitoring soil moisture, and so we see on the right moisture probes, well, evidence of them being buried as the cables disappear underground. So we've been looking at how soil moisture varies over time as well. A vast amount of data has been produced over 10 years now, and I can't talk to anything like all of it. But one thing I did want to highlight with this slide is that I think we've done a pretty good job in getting calibration gaugings across the full range of flows. So these are the original gauging sites in the table here. Underneath gaugings in cubic meters per second, we have the max and the min flows recorded over the entire duration by people out in the field measuring the flows. And then I've shown those maximum flows as a percentage of QMED, the median annual flood. And there are 4 sites where actually the highest gauging we've taken in the field is in excess of QMED. So I think we've done pretty well there. And there's another couple close to QMED as well. One site is almost double QMED. So we have done a lot of work in the field in order to get good calibrations at these natural sites. And with the density of monitoring we have at Eddleston, we have good opportunities to transfer information between gauge sites as necessary. Some of the sites make it quite difficult to get high flow measurements, which of course are so important to the study. So recently, working with Wallingford Hydro Solutions, we've done some topographic survey of the channel, including at this site here, the Early Vale gauge, longitudinal and cross-sectional surveys in order to be able to model the relationship between water level and flow. And so we've been able to combine the results of empirical gaugings out in the field with model simulated gaugings sat at the comfort of a desk in an office. And so we have the combined results here. And I think that's a good way of sort of taking a best of breed approach in order to help get confidence in the relationship between water level and flow at these gauging stations. Turning to the sort of results of our analyses, one of the early questions from the scoping report that Chris referred to was, where are the hotspots for generating the most rapid rates of runoff? And initial thoughts were that the eastern tributaries were quite important for this because they were the highest ground and had the steepest slopes. But actually, that's not really supported by the evidence that we see on this slide. So I've shown with the numbers on the map QMED per unit area. So the median flood flow obtained from our gauging station records as a ratio of catchment area at each of the gauge sites. And so one gauge stands out as having a particularly high QMED, so that's the Middleburn in the northwest of the catchment, 0.64 QMEX per square kilometre. And on the east side, actually, the Longcoat burn, the upper gauge there, curiously called Middle Longcoat, that produces a QMED per square K of only 0.14. Whereas the lower Longcoat site produces 0.32. So, actually, those results challenged us a bit. And we do now understand that base flows, groundwater flows in the Longcoat burn are quite important. And sometimes that catchment seems to produce quite an attenuated response just because of the geology of the catchment. And so, one thing that we've really wanted to do over these past 10 years is get to understand better how the geology is affecting the flows. And that lays the foundation on which NFM is built. One other thing to mention briefly, I mentioned snow before, but 2 of the largest peak flows that we've seen since the NFM measures went in have been affected by snowmelt. And so that wasn't something that was in our experimental design at all. But I think it makes really difficult interpretation of the NFM results, and generally we'll look to exclude those events. At least now we have the data to understand when snowmelt was taking place. Some of you will know these diagrams from the review article by Simon Dadson and colleagues in 2017, trying to summarize the evidence base for NFM at that time. The left-hand diagram shows that many measures are associated with their most substantial reduction in flood peaks just in small floods, but much less effective in larger floods, whereas floodplain measures are a bit different. Right-hand diagram shows the results of integrating catchment scale and flood magnitude, and point to the greatest effects happening when you've got small floods in small catchments. Eddleston was about a thorough, comprehensive monitoring effort in order to better understand what's going on there. And so one thing we did early on was to investigate what was happening to travel time after the first set of meanders were installed on the main stem of the Eddleston Water itself. And in fact, as Chris says, they've been added to in recent times. And okay, some of you might say that's quite a complicated looking diagram. It certainly shows that travel time for a flood event traveling down the Eddleston Water is not a consistent thing. It varies with event magnitude, seems to have varied a bit over time. There's some suggestion that travel times may have reduced, but actually one reason for that might be that NFM measures in the upper catchment are certainly leading to a slowing down of the runoff response there. So it's a complex system. We have focused on examining hydrological lag, and I think that is quite a good thing to focus on. It's easily understood by people living close to the watercourse and directly affected by flood risk, for example. If it means that more time can be given for warning them and for them to take actions to try and protect themselves, that's important. And it also might make a difference to how the runoff from this watercourse synchronizes or doesn't with the downstream river Tweed, which it joins in Peebles, shown in the photograph here. And focusing on lag allows us to avoid some of the difficulties with assumptions surrounding flow calibration ratings, base flow separation, and the accuracy of the rainfall amounts measured at rain gauges and how they apply to the catchment as a whole. So the next few slides will focus on hydrological lag, looking at the delay between the midpoint, the middle rain gauge tip of rainfall events through to the corresponding peak in the watercourse, as illustrated here. With a lot of data, there was a bit of data handling, processing to be done. And so at each of the sites with a full 9 years of record, we ranked all of the observed peaks and extracted the largest 100. We looked at excluding snowmelt events, but after months, years of number crunching, it seemed that doing that didn't actually make any difference to the results, except compromise our sample sizes. So snowmelt events are included in the data sets that we analyzed. We operated a 24-hour independence rule, so only one largest peak in any one 24-hour period was permitted to enter the sample to be analyzed. We required a 1 hour minimum gap between the end of one rainfall event and the start of the next one, and we limited lags to 8 hours, and any event exceeding 8 hours was clearly a complex event, and we excluded it from analysis. So let me just talk you through this slide here, which shows our main results from this analysis of lags. It's based around the idea of resampling median lag in hours as we work from the sample of 100 observed events and incrementally work towards higher thresholds, meaning larger floods. So flood event magnitude is on the left hand, the bottom axis of all of these graphs. So we start each one looking at the left hand end of all these data points. Solid blue dots are the median lag time pre-NFM. So it's like the baseline that we had. We had 2 years of baseline data at all of our gauges. Orange dots are the corresponding median lag time for the period of data after the NFM had been implemented. And if we read across left to right on that left-hand diagram, what we see is the blue medians generally staying the same or maybe getting a little bit lower, but certainly the orange medians, they become larger as we resample at higher thresholds. And so this indication is here that the median lag time was substantially increasing after the NFM measures were introduced. The solid lines are lower and upper quartile values, and the open circles are the individual lags for individual events which occurred as the very largest events. And you can't take a median of 1. Well, you could, but it's not very meaningful. So that's just to show you what the individual largest events were actually performing at as individual lag times. So at the middle burn, we've got flow restrictors, and there seemed to be a big increase in lag time. Top right-hand corner, we've got a combination of flow restrictors and ponds. And again, after the NFM was introduced, we find increasing lag times as you go towards larger thresholds. At the bottom of this slide, the combined catchment is downstream of where these 2 tributaries and some others come together, and the same effect is found. So those sites are shown with red lag times, median increases in the map here. And then while all 3 of those catchments showed statistically significant increases in lag, then none of the other gauge sites did. So as we work down the Eddleston catchment, it looks like those effects are being lost somewhat. We also had 2 control catchments in operation. They're shown with the blue results, and there was no significant change in the lags there either. This is the same idea plotted against catchment area. So we see the biggest increases in lag are in the small catchments, but this finding that at 25 square kilometers at the Early Vale gauge site, that I think suggests a larger catchment scale at which NFM is still being effective than people were generally expecting before, where talk was more about 5 or 10 square kilometer catchments being perhaps the limit of effectiveness. So we have our work that I've been talking about on lag times published just a few months ago in the Journal of Flood Risk Management. So that's the left-hand paper there. And meanwhile, the right-hand paper is one that Barry led based on some modeling work that he's been leading. And so that lets me hand over seamlessly to Barry to take on the story.
Thanks very much, Andrew and Chris, and thanks for the introduction. So we were tasked with following all this really detailed empirical evidence collecting to do some modelling to see if we could find some similarities and whether we can also treat nature-based solutions in a similar context to more traditional flood risk management measures in the way that we appraise risk. So could we model the NBS and then understand the risk reduction downstream and do it in a general framework that everyone else could kind of emulate in other catchments? So we're focusing on a direct net rainfall and runoff modelling using a 2D hydrodynamic model. And also the remit was that we would use open data and easily accessible techniques that are used in industry. So for instance, we used RefH2 for hydrology, and we calibrated the initial soil moisture storage using the calibration facility in that, which is generally what can be done as a consultant in practice. So in this catchment, we had a high quality digital terrain model, DTM. It was 0.5 meter resolution. And you can really, if you were to zoom in on there, you really can see a lot of detail. And we'd apply net rainfall from calibrated RefH events to that and understand where the water would transport to using the hydrodynamic model. We wanted to use a 2D only model, and we used HEC-RAS because this is license free. And it also has this subgrid topographic representation where the half-meter resolution is taken into account in storage tables and also for the conveyance across each cell face, even if you're using large numerical cells. So what we did was we took the DTM, we edited it, we applied broad scale modeling techniques. So for instance, some of the culverts and bridges are represented as cut throughs in the DTM here. So they create a bit of backwater, but they're not hydraulically as accurate. And then we added a land cover map and related the roughness to that, the Manning's roughness. And then we also, when we were incorporating the NFM after it was installed, we would change the topography or would change the roughness. And I'll look at that in a bit more detail. So we refined the mesh. So we did where we've got some major embankments, apply break lines and so on. And then the result is the maximum depth, as you can see there, overlaid on the satellite terrain. And also because we have this kind of whole system model of the entire catchment, it allows you to understand the synchronization issues in more detail. So next slide, please. So with this extensive data and time series collection we were able to model and do multi-scale calibration, so different scales. We were able to place constraints on this whole system model. So, and we did that before and after. The before hydrograph that we chose, one of the events is a nice unimodal peak, which is also used in Andrew's data. The after peak was a bit of a nasty multi-peaked event, which wasn't so easy to model with this technique. We ended up looking at the peak, the last peak, and trying to match that. But obviously there are subterranean effects, there's memory and there's infiltration and so on going on, which aren't matched in the 2D representation. But you can see that at different points in the catchment, at different scales, so upper middle burn on the left, top left, and working down through the catchment, down to the bottom of the catchment, we had pretty good calibration across the different peaks that we modeled pre and post NFM installation. So that gave us some confidence in the model that we could start looking at the effect of some of the NFM measures on the hydraulics. So we weren't focusing on infiltration rates and changes to wet canopy evaporation in woodland. We were focusing on the deflection, the lateral deflection of water onto the floodplains, and the changes as resulting from remeandering and the extra storage from ponds and so on. You can also see that we tried to use as much calibration data was available. So for some of the historic peaks, you can see that there were some trash line survey, and we were able to sort of make a reasonable match with that. Can you go on to the next slide, please? So we did some comparisons with the model for a bit more model proving before and after with a detailed 2D model from a Peebles flood study. You can see there the very slim similarities between the existing study and the whole catchment model on the right. I haven't added the scale there, so that's a bit misleading. But one of the issues that we did find with the DTM was that there was an offset or a tilt between the old DTM and the new DTM. So it's obviously important to recognize these at the start of a study. Next slide, please, Andrew. We were able to study a range of things, including synchronization, but we're also trying to emulate some of the work that had been done on the lag time. We're not looking at the difference between the rainfall peak and the hydrograph peak here. We're looking at the time between peaks. And we didn't have, we were also interested in the very high flow events. So we think that, these were the largest events recorded on record. Before and after NFM, and the pre-NFM on the left, the difference in the sort of travel time for the final peak was perhaps 2 hours, but perhaps the noisiness in that peak there's uncertainty in the gauging, there's uncertainty in the modelling, So perhaps that's a little bit lucky. But I think one thing that's which is really powerful is the use of hundreds of events that were looked at in terms of the change to the lag time. So that empirical evidence is really strong, whereas this model gives you an opportunity to study the different timings around the whole catchment in more detail. Next slide, please. Okay, so how did we represent some of the NFM? So there's been some nice summary papers on representing, for instance, leaky barriers in 2D or 1D hydraulic models. We did actually do some experimentation representing NFM leaky barriers, or these that extend across the floodplain using hydraulic units, and then also using an increase in roughness. You might see that in the Addy and Wilkinson paper, for instance. What we found was when we did a model on the right, you can see there's a mesh. You might just be able to tell there are about 40 hydraulic structures in there, which are trying to represent the slot and the barrier extending across the floodplain with suitable roughness coefficients and so on. When we used that technique, and we of course had to refine the mesh size, reduce the time step to avoid instabilities, we eventually got a similar answer to when we increased the roughness to something that's in the literature, so around 0.2 in the channel, to represent the net effect of lots of these features. So we were getting a similar shaped hydrograph either way. And I think some of the mechanism there is that either approach to representing the NFM creates a backwater, which then connects some of the higher flows with the floodplain. So both ways do that. So there's no good looking at this just in 1D. It's the kind of 2D response and the taking up of that storage by high flows that's important. So in the final model, we actually just used a roughness because then we could have more manageable run times. Next slide, please. So you can see some of the results, middle burn, which was highlighted earlier, with and without the NFM features represented. And you can also see on the right comparisons for the with the trash line survey, the kind of spatial extent. We've been trying to use more remotely sensed data. Actually, this is a trash line survey for a single event. We've been trying to pull off information from Sentinel and compare flood outlines that way. And I think there's still a long way to go before we can constrain these bigger models with these spatial patterns. But we did what was available. Next slide, please. So in a larger catchment, which was also referred to in that paper at the start, so this is the Colne, which is about 4 times the size of the Eddleston, we found similar effects. We've found that we're trying to explain why the NFM features designed in this way, which think about the system, they think about the source and the pathways to expandable areas of flood storage. You can see from the climate change simulations that were done in this catchment, where for those bigger and bigger events with increased rainfall amounts and so on, you can see that the places where the attenuation is taking place are where we're able to reach bigger areas of field storage. Next slide, please. So what we did for Eddleston, so back to Eddleston, we modelled a series of about 9 design events. This is single peaked, and we looked at for each of those events, with and without, using the calibrations that we've just done across multi-scales. And you can see that for each of the solid lines, which are the pre-NFM, and the dashed lines that are post-NFM, we get some attenuation. So we were trying to explain that in terms of those areas of expandable storage. So if your NFM is designed right and you're pushing water into those areas, then it can go on working and provide some resilience against increasing flows. That might not look like much, you know, it's perhaps 5%, something like that in terms of the peak flow reduction. But when you integrate the impacts and you integrate the losses versus probability curve, you come up with annual average damages of about £60,000, which doesn't sound a lot either, but over a scheme lifetime that might scale up, and we had estimates of around about net present value of about £1 million. But that's not the only benefit associated with NFM, and of course they bring lots of co-benefits. So I'm going to hand over again to Chris now, and he's going to talk about those multiple benefits.
Thanks very much, Barry. This is just a very last quick bit, because obviously, as I said at the beginning, the project wasn't just about flooding, it was also about to what extent NFM can improve habitats and species. And the bit we focused on was remeandering. Here's a nice aerial photograph of just how straight that river was before we started. 3 different timings of remeanderings there. There is a PhD study, Isabel Costaz at Dundee University, also looking at the hydrological and hydromorphological impacts of meandering. But what we were interested in was using the opportunity to link hydromorphological interventions with real detail of ecological response. So we'll go very quickly through these. Andrew, next please. A typical Bachy design before after control. Channel reconfiguration occurred in 2013, so we were able to get surveys done beforehand. This is the ecological sampling, and you can see we've been doing this ever since. We have the fantastic advantage that one person, Lorraine Quinn at SEPA, has done all the invertebrate monitoring, so we've removed that variation from it. We're working at the moment this year, we'll do it again in 2023, and we're really interested in this trajectory of recovery. How long does it take for a restorated river or a restored river to actually get back or improve? Okay, next please. And what we did was to do, the methods were, you can tell, high tech here. You cut the bottom off a tin bin, but we looked at habitat monitoring and channel sediment work, led largely by SEPA here, alongside the aquatic invertebrate work. So these were done in the same time, and we were looking in huge detail at the habitats, the channel sediment measurements, and using measures from the Wentworth scale and literally sieving, I was going to say tons, but it's certainly kilogram loads of substrate to have a look at what's actually changed before and after in our Bachy design. Okay. Alongside that, as I said, we did invertebrate monitoring. That's the main area was done. It's a modified standard kick sampling. Again, huge numbers here, and we're going to try and look at eDNA as a methodology this year. Also, electrofishing work was well done there, but I won't talk about that. Okay, next, please. This really captures what we're looking at. This is some work from Veritas Ecology from Jennifer Dodd, now at Edinburgh Napier. And it's a PCA, and if you just look at the 2 arrows, you've got Lake Wood, which was the major remeandering, and the variability of available habitat before and after restoration. And all you need to see from that is before restoration, it was a very simplified environment in terms of ecology and hydromorphological structure. And afterwards, it was very much wider. So that's the impact immediately in terms of improving the variability of physical habitat. Next one, please. And you can look at that in terms of the methods that ecologists often use about looking at morphological units, the 5 types: shoots, riffles, runs, glides, pools. And again, this is just taking Lakewood. Before in blue, 2009, and this is the data from 2016, and already by then you'd seen a much greater variety of habitats. And along with that, we've had a rapid recolonization of these meandered channels. We've got much more channel for a starter, actually. That's one of the other things we've done. Obviously, if you increase river length, which is what you do with remeandering, you create more channel and more spawning habitats for salmon as well. So we've got an increase in physical diversity, and we've got this very nicely shown under a Bachy experiment. Next one, please. And perhaps the most significant thing here is the increase in active bar features that we've seen, and you can see the difference here between control and restored. Such changes as these are really important because it's that spatial distribution that drives the patterns, the extents and the variability of morphological unit types, and that drives the ecology, and in particular the invertebrates here. This is data, this is information that's still being collected, as I said, and we're interested in that trajectory. So watch this space for both this year and then 2023. Okay, next please. Now, the last things then is just to say and wrap up here is that clearly, if you look across everything we've done here, we're getting emerging results, and it is very much emerging. One of the things we did at the very beginning, and Scottish Government bought into this, was to actually say we were doing a long-term empirical study. It wasn't a short-term modelling one, no problems with those, but actually we were getting real data and seeing all the variability. And you've got here that different NFM measures can reduce flood risk. We've obviously got the need to do widespread application of many types across a whole catchment. But as Barry indicated, and as we're looking at, we've got a whole range of additional benefits and ecosystem services that NFM measures produce that clearly structural measures don't. And we've got the potential for a lot more. And I put that in at the bottom because the current bit of remeandering is actually being undertaken through funding from Sustrans, who support active travel, walking and cycling. So a new walkway, cycling way is being built up from the bottom of the catchment, coming up the catchment, and hopefully eventually all the way to Edinburgh. And that's bringing a lot more people. It's actually also paying for some restoration work. It's paying for some new ponds. So these really are massively important things, not just in terms of flood risk. Finally, then, the final slide, to try and put some money on this, because that's key. Working with JBA and Mott MacDonald, we've actually looked at what this actually means. And as Barry said, we've got a very good figure from the existing stuff that we've done. So the existing measures of £250,000 of flood damages avoided. But if we actually then add up the co-benefits using a variety of methods, but basically the best ones that are available, we could actually top that with another 4.2 million net present value from water quality improvements, carbon management, recreation. And that's just what we've done, working voluntarily with farmers through Tweed Forum as that trusted intermediary. We did one enhanced scenario where we actually doubled the number of meander lengths we've done, and we've already moved towards that. As you've seen, we increased the tree planting to meet the target for Scottish Government's tree planting. So possibilities, if you like, and we got in that case to £2.85 million in terms of flood damages, but a further 17.7 million net present value from additional benefits. And that really is quite a staggering figure when you think about it. So what we're saying here is that natural flood management has huge value in terms of its flood damage, but also you need to look at the absolute additional things that you get on top of that, and which we can now start putting figures on. And in fact, Scottish Government are now looking at that and thinking how this can be tied into the whole process of flood scheme appraisal going forward. So with that, I'll go on to the last one, which is just a huge thank you to all the collaborators, and in particular, as I said, the land managers and the community. This is all done voluntarily rather than us going out there and saying we'd like to remeander this. It needs to be negotiated to fit their business models as much as it fits the idea of the research. Thanks very much.
Thanks all. Fascinating presentation, really impressive project and research. So we've got a few minutes for questions. Perhaps if there's some in the chat, and I know you've been busy answering some of those. We had a few submitted beforehand. Perhaps if I ask one of those to let you gather your thoughts. And one of the questions submitted was about the design of monitoring. What evidence indicates success, and what technical skills for data collection and technical technical skills for analysis? How specialist is it?
So if I can take that, Gerard, so thanks for the question. I think evidence of success, I mean, you first and foremost, you want the monitoring to work so that it's measured what it was intended to measure. So there was a question in the chat about uncertainty on the rating calibrations themselves. So I think that's one thing we look to, and simply capturing the complete record. But then there's, if you're trying to do an empirical study, you'd be looking to compare evidence of your hydrology before the measures with afterwards. And actually, you're in the lap of the gods there to a certain extent, because you have to see what weather comes along and whether it's going to, or how it's going to test your NFM on the ground. How specialist is the monitoring and the expertise necessary? I think experience is a really valuable thing, and I don't want to talk too long about that. But really trying to find somebody that's done this kind of thing before is important. And one lesson that I would say I learned when I took the lead to run the hydrometry at the start of the project, I assumed what we were about was really capturing the detail of flood peaks. And what I wasn't assuming is that people would equally want to know about low flows with similar levels of accuracy. And you just can't ever anticipate all the needs that people might have for the data that you're collecting. So try and anticipate that, but speak to somebody with experience. I think I should stop it there so we've got time for some other questions.
I'll just add one other thing to that, if I can, Gerard, and that is that success obviously is very much in the eye of who it is who's asking the question. And one of the key target audience, if you like, is the commuters who go up that road between Peebles and Edinburgh every day, is the local community, is the local press. And we need to see and listen to what they see as success. And so far, they're definitely on side with us, thinking this is worthwhile doing because they see it every day as they walk past. And we've had some very positive comments in the local press, which is actually a very important part of success if you're talking about science into policy.
Thanks. Are there any questions from the chat that you'd like to pick up on? Got some more pre-submitted ones if not.
Well, I've given a very detailed account of how much money has been spent that someone did ask. But one of the things to add on top of that is clearly this was a research project. It's not a project just to deliver NFM. So there are very large research amounts in there that you wouldn't normally have. And the other thing is actually the trusted intermediary working in between gets a very good deal in a way that quite often other people probably wouldn't get in terms of costs.
If I could just answer this question from Wazim, has there been any comparison of modelled QH rating, flow to stage rating of leaky log dams against observed data? So it's worth mentioning that there was a Newcastle University PhD by Mary Barnes and supervised by James Bathurst and Paul Quinn. So that did some detailed work on the flow restrictors, leaky dams that were put in on the middle burn. So that's probably the best source of information there.
Yeah, there's also currently Elizabeth Follett at Cardiff University is doing measurements in the laboratory as well, and looking at different QH relationships for different barriers and densities. There's a question from Wasim as well about why didn't we use a 1D, 2D link model? You don't always have the budget to do that. You don't always have the cross sections, and you don't have. What we're trying to do is kind of make use of available tools and new emerging data. So the half-meter DTM that was flown, it was flown in relatively low flows. A lot of the channel is exposed. And a lot of the bathymetry, of course, you've got the problem with filtering and so on. But it in terms of what you're missing, yes, there's obviously some uncertainties, but as the flows get higher, this becomes a small proportion of the total flows that you're interested in.
Okay, thanks. Shall I'll ask another one of the pre-submitted questions. Are NFM interventions designed to a minimum standard to avoid failure under weight and pressure of water?
Blunt answer, no, in our case, for most of these. There is, though, very good evidence gradually being brought together in the Syria guidance, which I think will come online fairly soon, which I know a lot of people have submitted data to. And I think Barry said you have been able to model the potential of sort of cascade failures of things like debris dams, have you not?
Yeah, in the QNFM project, we have been looking at the whole system, the risk from the whole system. So you've got a system of leaky barriers, take into account cascade failure alongside other risks. And obviously there's ways of mitigating against that. You could have, for instance, like in Pennygill in Flimby, have lots of large wood in the channel downstream of your leaky barriers that tangle it all up and prevent a surge, or reduce the risk from a surge, I should say.
Well, thanks. I think we've run out of time, I'm afraid. So I'll just conclude. as I said at the beginning, the webinar recording will be available on our website. I included a link in the chat, and we'll also make available a copy of the slides, so you can access those. And just oh dear, sorry about this. Right, yeah, so if you do have any feedback, please get in touch with us about the webinar or follow-up questions. You can see contact details for Chris, Andrew and Barry below, if we didn't have time to answer your question or something else comes to mind. Our next webinar is on the 23rd of September, and Dr. Richard Smith, who's a soil specialist from the Environment Agency, will be talking about understanding soils and NFM. If you'd like to keep in touch with us and our research, then there's a newsletter you can sign up for. I get the links in the chat. So just remains to say thanks very much to Chris, Andrew and Barry for an excellent presentation, and I hope you'll be able to join us for our next webinar. Cheerio and good afternoon.
Thanks, Gerard.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.